The Federal Court of La Plata in Argentina authorized the departure from the country of 12 crew members of the Venezuelan plane of the FTS airline. Venezuela accepts to be a guarantor in the peace process between the Colombian state and the National Liberation Army after President Gustavo Petro's request. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe called for an immediate ceasefire on the Armenian and Azerbaijani border. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from the teleSUR studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. The Federal Court of La Plata in Argentina authorized the departure from the country of 12 crew members of the Venezuelan plane of the FTS airline held as a Ezeiza for the last 3 months. The ruling will define in 10 days the procedural situation of the Venezuelan and Iranian citizens who were part of the crew of the FTS airplane and confirm the lifting of the prohibition to leave the country that benefited part of the original 19 crew members of the aircraft. The measure ordered Judge Federico Villena to expedite and conclude all pending proceedings, the definition of the procedural situation, and of the restrictions imposed on persons and things. The notification confirms the assigned scope of the prohibition to the other 7 crew members, whose defense said that the chamber will have to review some measures. This Tuesday, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador met with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. In the meeting, issues of bilateral importance were discussed.
We told him that we were not going to remain silent if migrants were mistreated, much less if Mexicans were mistreated. And I spoke about the case of the wall, that President Biden has said that he's not going to build a wall, and he's complying, and he's the only one.
The President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, emphasized that both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund should apologize to the world for the impoverishment of the nations.
All this that did so much damage, when the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were deciding on the agenda to be applied by national governments, the so-called structural reforms, that meant looting, impoverishment, corruption, violence. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank should offer an apology, make a self-criticism, and offer an apology to all the countries of the world.
This Tuesday, President of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, accepted Colombia's proposal to be guarantor in the peace talks with the ELN.
Yesterday, there came a letter from President Gustavo Petro of Colombia proposing that Venezuela accept the character of becoming guarantor of the negotiations and peace agreements of the Colombian government with the ELN. And I told President Gustavo Petro and Colombia that once again, as did Commander Chavez in his time to guarantee the peace agreements that were then signed and that I had to participate as guarantor, once again President Gustavo Petro and Colombia will say Venezuela accepts the character of guarantor of the negotiations and the peace agreements of Colombia with the ELN, and we will put our best will in the name of God Almighty Father and for the total peace of Colombia.
In Venezuela, the Secretary General of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, Haytham Al-Ghais, was received by the Foreign Minister Carlos Faria. Al-Ghais and his delegation arrived in the Caribbean country in order to participate in the 32nd ministerial meeting in order to celebrate 62 years of the creation of the multilateral organization. The work agenda includes a meeting of Haytham Al-Ghais with the Venezuelan Minister of Energy and Oil, Tarek El Aissami, to talk about energy issues. On Tuesday, the Colombian military announced it has captured 6 Brazilians who were illegally extracting gold in the Amazon jungle using 4 dredges that were destroyed. Since late August, the military forces have destroyed 12 machines, including the 4 that were located in the last hours in the vicinity of the Purete River, in the Department of Amazonas. According to General Galindo, the Brazilians detained apparently would be at the service of the armed group Comandos de la Frontera, an organization formed by former guerrillas and paramilitaries that emerged in 2020. The operation is part of the offensive ordered by President Gustavo Petro on the directive illegal dredge dynamite. The government of Colombia set among its priorities the care of the Amazon, given the advance of deforestation that has destroyed 7,018 square kilometers of forest, mainly in that region that extends over 9 countries.
In the course of the military operation by our national army, in coordination with the national police, 4 dredgers were destroyed and 6 Brazilian nationals were caught in the act and captured, who were apparently serving the organized armed group Los Comandos de la Frontera, accused of the crime of illegal exploitation of mining deposits.
President Miguel Díaz-Canel said that Cuba is ready to hold a popular referendum on the family code next September 25. Through his Twitter account, the Cuban president invited citizens to participate in the elections and said that it would be like a day of celebration for the nation. In addition, he said the new legislation was not made to design or assume a family construct tied to any person's ethical or religious convictions. Provincial governors headed by Díaz-Canel discussed the preparations for the celebration of the popular referendum, in which voters will have to decide whether to approve the family code, a law considered of extraordinary importance for society's development. Protests continue in Haiti against the increase in fuel prices announced by Prime Minister Ariel Henry. This is a new day of protest in which the citizens erected barricades to block avenues in the capital of the country after the announcement of the executive. The protests in the Caribbean nation intensified after the announcement, which, according to the government, seeks to guarantee the availability of fuel in service stations in the middle of a long crisis of shortages. Let us take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back from the South. Lower gas costs slowed U.S. inflation for a second straight month in August, but most other prices across the economy kept rising, evidence that inflation remains a heavy burden for U.S. households. Consumer prices rose 8.3% from a year earlier and 0.1% from July, but the jump in core prices, which exclude volatile food and energy costs, was especially worrisome. It outpaced expectations and ignited fear that the Federal Reserve will boost interest rates more aggressively and raise the risk of a recession. The government said that businesses are still raising prices in response to robust consumer demand. Inflation is higher than many U.S. have ever experienced, escalating families' grocery bills, rents, and utility costs, among other expenses. The mortal remains of Queen Elizabeth II arrived in London, where they will remain for 5 days in a mortuary chapel at Buckingham Palace. The coffin was carried by 8 bearers from St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh on Tuesday and was received by a guard of honor from the Queen's Squadron from Scotland, where she spent the last days after her death at Balmoral Castle. As part of the royal procession, her remains will be moved on Wednesday in public procession to Westminster Hall, the seat of Parliament of the United Kingdom. The president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, warned about the imminent risk of an armed conflict in Kosovo. During a special session of the Serbian parliament, President Vučić pointed out an increased presence of the Pristina Special Police Force in the northern regions of Kosovo and Metohija. The president warned that the crisis is not created by the Serbian side and warned about the approaching danger in the region, so that his nation faces significant security challenges. The special session in Belgrade is taking place amidst a climate of constant pressure from the West on the Serbian government to recognize the self-declared Republic of Kosovo. From Poland, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe calls for an immediate cessation of the armed conflict on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The president of the organization, Zbigniew Rau, made the request in connection with the recent clashes in the border area. In this regard, Rao pointed out that the increase in hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan jeopardizes the progress that has been made in resolving the dispute, such as the agreement signed by the parties to continue working on a peace treaty. And he also stressed that these new clashes endanger both this progress and countless lives. The Pentagon revealed that it has supplied some 47,000 tons of arms and equipment to Europe as part of its military assistance to Ukraine. According to the U.S. military agency, since the beginning of Russia's military operation in Ukraine, Washington has committed more than $14.5 billion in assistance to the Slavic country. At the same time, the United States Transport Command provided military support to several European countries, among them NATO members, where more than 700 flights were used to transport weapons to that continent. Following the supply of weapons from the Pentagon, Russian military authorities have warned that many of these weapons are ended up on the black market and stressed that neither Kiev nor the West know where these weapons will eventually end up, posing a potential increase in terrorist practices and a threat to global security. Syria affirmed that it will not spare no effort to guarantee a dignified, safe and voluntary return of the displaced and refugees to their homes in the areas liberated from terrorism. A return to Damascus denounces Washington and its allies are making conditional on a political change that serves their interests in the Arab country. From Damascus, our correspondent Hisham Wanos with the story.
Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal al-Mikdad, during his meeting with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, reaffirmed Damascus' interest in the return of Syrians to their homes and expressed readiness to cooperate with the United Nations to achieve this goal, far from politicizing this issue. These statements are in line with the Syrian position announced at the International Conference on the Return of Syrian Refugees held in Damascus in 2020 and the subsequent 4 joint meetings of the Syrian-Russian ministerial bodies to facilitate this return.
All Syrian government institutions, including ministries, provincial governments and other entities, are working tirelessly to complete the rehabilitation of infrastructure and the restoration of services to ensure the right conditions for the safe and dignified return of refugees to their liberated cities, towns and villages.
The 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, like the Lebanese, are suffering from the repercussions of the unprecedented political, social and economic crisis in the country of the settlers. Despite the United Nations rejection, the Lebanese authorities proposed a plan for the monthly return of 15,000 Syrians to their country, a plan that Beirut says Damascus welcomed and expressed its willingness to receive all those who wish to return with a commitment to provide them with aid, services, housing, medical care, education, and more.
Lebanon is pressing for a solution to the refugee problem, which it considers to be a major burden in the current circumstances of economic crisis. And for this reason, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee Affairs, Filippo Grandi, is currently visiting the region to discuss the issue, although I believe it is difficult to reach an agreement since even Western countries are using this issue as a political pressure card.
Contrary to the Western version, Damascus claims that it prioritized the creation of conditions for such a return, including the establishment of 480 temporary reception centers throughout the country, the rehabilitation of infrastructure in liberated areas, the issuance of amnesty decrees, and the approval of procedures to facilitate and simplify procedures in border areas. Actions which, despite the difficulties caused by the war and the blockade, have facilitated the return to their homes of more than 1 million refugees abroad and nearly 5 million of the 7 million internally displaced persons in the last 3 years.
Hisham Wanos, teleSUR, Damascus, Syria.
More news coming up after a final short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi emphasized that security in the Caucasus region is very important for Iran and explained that the situation and developments in the region are constantly being monitored because another war cannot be tolerated. In a phone call he received from Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan on Tuesday, Raisi expressed his concern over the ongoing tension in the region, which is going through special circumstances and stability has not been achieved. Raisi said the signatories of the tripartite ceasefire declaration should abide by its provisions and avoid any action that would provoke tension in the area. The Iranian president spoke out on the influence of Israel in the region, stating that its presence is a threat to the entire area. Raisi added that the historical borders of Iran and Armenia are the cornerstone of prosperity, rapprochement, and security in the region, and Tehran is determined to continue cooperation in all fields for the benefit of prosperity and stability. The bodies of 2 people were recovered after a 4-story residential building collapsed in Jordan's capital Tuesday, authorities said, adding that 14 more were rescued but others remain trapped. Security spokesman Amer al-Sartawi said civil defense forces were being supported by teams from the Regional Security Command and the Gendarmerie, adding that efforts to save more were ongoing. Rescue workers could be seen digging through the collapsed rubble as emergency vehicles gathered outside the site of the accident. Prime Minister Bishal al-Kasawuneh inspected the damaged building along with the Ministers of Interior, Health and Information. Government spokesman Faisal al-Chabul told reporters that the Kasawuneh had ordered the mayor of Amman and other officials to investigate the cause of the collapse. The head of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Missions in Sudan, Volker Perthes, said that the longer the political paralysis will last in the African country.
As a political stalemate continues, the human rights situation has also not improved. Since my last briefing here, 20 protesters were killed and at least 1,700 injured. I've more than once deemed it necessary to publicly condemn the excessive use of force by security forces, as well as their targeting of health facilities and medical staff.
And in the world of sports, the European Champions League had a new day and the most awaited match took place between Barcelona and Bayern Munich. And we have come to the end of this news brief, where you can find these and many other stories on our website telesurenglish.net, and join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. And you can also follow us on TikTok account at teleSUR English, in which you will be able to see news in different formats, news updates and much more. For teleSUR English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.